Good evening, everybody. It's 6 o'clock UK time, and thanks for joining me again as always. So yeah, it's awesome. I'm just having a look at the live chat, and we've got so many people from all around the world. It's it's brilliant to see. Literally, Astor from Honduras. We've got people from Greece. We've got people from Kenya, Zaragoza, and some from London and UK too as well. So thanks for joining me as always. This is day 2, I think it feels like, from the prep that I've done. It's been a while in the making, but yeah, thanks for joining. For those that are joining for the first time, the structure of the course, just to explain in a little bit of detail, is every day at 6 o'clock GMT, I'm going to do around about a half an hour chat on a particular area of the football industry, usually player and agent related for the first couple of weeks. Then I'm going to hopefully delve into some other topics, and then do 10 or 15 minutes, me having a brief chat, and then 10 or 15 minutes, if possible, answering all of your excellent questions. And there were some great ones yesterday. So I'm just hoping that I'll be able to know a decent amount of the answers. So as always, spread the word. We're broadcasting every day at this time until at least the 7th of April. And all of the recordings will be available afterwards as well. So yesterday's, I think, has already got 700 or 800 views, which is awesome. It's over 100 people joining already, which is amazing. It's fantastic. So yeah, these are resources that are freely available and ready for people to watch. And just very briefly as well, talking just about the schedule for the rest of this week. So today is talking about player transfers. On Wednesday, we've got a session on player contracts, where I'll be talking all about wages, bonuses, release clauses, buyout clauses, rights of first refusal, all of that type of stuff. Thursday is going to be talking about boot deals, because I think sometimes there's some really interesting issues that come up there. And Friday, image rights. So this week is pretty player focused. And that's more or less the idea, at least for the time being. Next week is talking quite a lot about agents and how agents interact in the industry. And then if everyone's still interested after that, then hopefully we can get onto the club side of things. So what I wanted to do was probably just talk through the structure for at least the next 10, 12 minutes or something. And then hopefully when I've done that, and we talk through some of those ideas, then we're going to hopefully give some answers rather to the questions that you're starting to send through already, which is great. So football transfers. It's impossible, obviously, to talk in too much detail in 10 or 15 minutes, and we'll get there with the questions. But I really wanted to delve into probably 3 specific topics. That's what I'm going to try and do for each of these sessions, is talk about things in threes. So the first area that I'm going to touch on is what actually is a transfer fee. But more importantly, what a transfer fee is what's the difference between the fixed and contingent elements of a transfer fee. So we'll talk about that in some detail, talk about how installments actually work, usually in transfers too. I think after that, the second point we're going to talk about are sell-on clauses. And those effectively are clauses which are put into transfer agreements, whereby if the player then subsequently moves on, then the selling club will receive a certain percentage of that transfer fee. And the third thing I want to touch on as well is the free transfer era that Jean-Marc Bosman more or less brought in the mid-90s. And that's where free agency becomes the norm. Quotas became illegal, and players benefited from their ability to be in a much stronger negotiation position. So something to think about for the rest of the session. I'd be really keen on everyone's thoughts on the live chat. Is let me know what you think your best all-time Bosman transfer has been. I'm not going to give away too many examples that I think have been pretty good. And as a Liverpool fan, I think there's probably a couple of very good ones too. But yeah, start racking your brains and start giving me a little bit of info or your answers to what you think the best ever Bosman transfer has been. And then when we come back to that in about 5 or 10 minutes, we'll go through some of those answers. So number 1 was, what is a transfer fee? Now, ultimately, a transfer fee is an agreement between selling and buying club in relation to releasing the player from his employment contract with the selling club, and then effectively being able to subsequently register that player with the new football association or the new club, and that club entering into an employment contract with that particular player. And I think the thing, without skirting over lots of things, because I don't have a huge amount of time, but wanted to get through a few elements, is discussing the difference between what are fixed amounts, i.e. guaranteed amounts that are due under a transfer agreement, and contingent payments, which are effectively payments which are contingent, subject or conditional on a particular type of event happening. And the example that I usually try and give for this is Philippe Coutinho, when he eventually moved from Liverpool to Barcelona relatively recently. And the thing that I always find interesting, especially in the press, the way the press report stories, is I believe at least it was reported that Coutinho was bought by Barcelona for £146 million was the reported amount. And I think, obviously, when you see that back page spread, which is Coutinho sold for £146 million, I think a lot of people will think that on that day, whenever the transfer happens, or within a few days of that transfer happening, that Barcelona will pay to Liverpool 146 million, and that will be it. Now, that's not the reality usually of a lot of the deals, the vast majority of deals that I see, and it's usually struck in such a way as follows. There's two bits. One is the fixed and contingent elements, and the second is usually a lot of even the fixed elements, i.e. the guaranteed amounts, are paid in installments. So if I just give that Phil Coutinho example again, if the headline figure is £146 million, usually, at least what was reported by the Liverpool Echo at the time, was that Barcelona would be paying a set fixed amount in 4 installments, and that fixed amount was supposed to be around the £100 million mark. So if those 100 million divided by 4, obviously is £25 million a season, it was reported that actually Barcelona were paying a fixed guaranteed amount to Liverpool of £25 million per season. The remaining 46 was reported to be in relation to all of these contingent, all of these conditional payments, which were probably related to Barcelona winning La Liga, Barcelona winning the Champions League, but most importantly also that player fulfilling a certain amount of appearances. So what can sometimes happen on these contingent or conditional payments is, even if the club fulfills that particular condition, if the player hasn't actually really influenced or made a big difference for that season, i.e. by not appearing, sometimes that contingent payment won't necessarily be paid. So that's the first thing, which is ultimately what we're talking about with Coutinho. Even if the headline amount was £146 million, if you actually break that down, and Barcelona didn't actually win anything and didn't have particular performance and contingent payments that were crystallised, Liverpool on a yearly season basis were only going to receive £25 million from a perceived £146 million deal. So I think that's the first thing that's important to note, which is transfer fees are usually split between conditionality payments and obviously fixed fees. And then the next element, which is always the case, is that those payments are usually, even if they're guaranteed, are usually paid in installments. There are exceptions to the rule, and some clubs pay up front, maybe to get a discount on the transfer fee, etc. But on the whole, it's still the case that transfers are paid over installments. The next point, the second point that I wanted to mention was in relation specifically to sell-on clauses. So sell-on clauses are becoming more common, I think, in a lot of ways, for lots of different reasons, but especially because of the prominence of a number of clubs selling on what might be their prized assets, not maybe wanting to sell them, but actually if there is the added benefit of, if that player goes on and does very well, that there could be a very big transfer to actually occur as a result. That I've seen some sell-on clauses which can be between 10 and 25% potentially. So that means that when a selling club in the transfer agreement agrees with the buying club that, as well as providing a certain amount of money by way of transfer fee, that there is an agreement that if that player transfers on while after being at the buying club, then the selling club will receive a certain percentage of that amount. Now, where it can get a tiny bit complicated, interesting, there can be different bargaining positions at play, relates to just a couple of examples I was thinking about in preparing for the matter, preparing for the video now. And the first was actually the example of Gareth Bale when he was at Spurs, and sooner rather than later, Daniel Levy understood that he was probably going to be moving to Real Madrid. And at the time, Spurs had bought Bale from Southampton. And as a result of the transfer agreement between Southampton and Spurs, there was quite a significant sell-on clause, which would obviously have meant that if Spurs then sold Bale on to whoever it might have been, and then subsequently Madrid, that Southampton would have been entitled to a significant amount. Now, what Daniel Levy did, because Southampton were in financial difficulty, was effectively waive that transfer agreement, so that both parties agreed to receive less money. I think it was reported that Southampton received 1.5 million plus a reserve goalkeeper in exchange for that release clause. That sell-on clause to effectively be ended and varied. And in that case, then obviously that led Spurs to be able to then sell Bale to Madrid and earn a significant amount of money. And there were a couple of other examples I was looking at as well, where I think one of the biggest sell-on clauses, amounts that's been provided, was in relation to John Stones's almost £50 million move from Everton to Manchester City, where Barnsley were entitled to, I think between, I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was reported to be around £7 million. So you can see the value that sell-on clauses can bring. And that's a very important element of a transfer agreement negotiation and the commercial deal and negotiation that can be struck between buying and selling a club. And actually, on my YouTube page at the moment, there's actually a video that I did with Omar Chowdhury, as I mentioned, from 21st Club. We specifically actually talk about the benefits of release clauses and why that can be sometimes a lever for the negotiation, i.e. a selling club might accept maybe a smaller transfer fee if they believe that they can get more of a sell-on clause, a percentage, because then ultimately in 2 or 3 years it might be a significantly lucrative amount that club can then recoup if the buying club then sells on that player to another club in the years ahead. So that's number 2, sell-on clauses. So we've talked about what transfer fee is and the difference between fixed and contingent payments, and why payments are usually in installments. Talk then about sell-on clauses and why they can be pretty lucrative, and in fact very lucrative. And then the third area I wanted to briefly talk about was free transfers and the Bosman ruling. So it's funny, when I was at university doing my undergrad degree, I was able to write my third-year dissertation on the Bosman ruling and the changes to the FIFA system, transfer system. And here I am, few years on, still discussing Bosman. So yeah, Bosman's probably one of the most important, if not the most important, football case that's come around in the last however many decades. The short story is that Jean-Marc Bosman was a player at Liège, and another French club, I think at the time Dunkirk, wanted to buy him, and so unfortunately, the club that he was with, even though they weren't playing him or paying him anymore because his contract had expired, refused to provide his registration to this new club and said that they wanted a transfer fee, even though there was no valid employment contract with the player left. So that refusal to register the player with a new club more or less brought a challenge by Bosman. That was in 1990. It was only till 1995, actually, that the Court of Justice actually came out with its pretty seminal decision. And the decision more or less was that if a player was out of contract, i.e. his employment contract has expired, he was able then to be able to then move freely between clubs and between EU member state clubs at that. There was also another element to the Bosman decision, which actually related also to quotas. There were actually foreign quotas that were in place for UEFA competitions. You could sort of have a number of foreigners and then assimilated players, and that was obviously what seems obvious now, but that was against free movement and discrimination law. So that was another element of the liberalisation, I guess, of the transfer market that Bosman brought in. And I think then, as a result of that, the major benefits to players is that, and this has really been for the very high-profile ones and those that have had their contracts running out at different times, that when a club doesn't have to pay a transfer fee because the player is out of contract, the clubs can incentivize that player to be able to join them by offering huge salaries and huge signing on fees, simply because that transfer fee, instead of going to a club, can go to the player in a certain percentage or proportion of that by way of player remuneration. And so what you've tended to see across the industry now, especially for the extremely elite players that have transferred on free transfers, and we'll talk about those in a second, it's been a hugely lucrative, eye-opening ability for those players to be able to maximize their value when there isn't a transfer fee to be paid. So that's what I wanted to briefly talk about. That's 15 minutes or so in. And I've seen loads of different questions that have come in, and particular elements here on who are the best. Let's just have a quick look to see who are the best free transfers that people have possibly come up with. So we've got Sol Campbell, Pogba, Pirlo, which is a great one, Milner to Liverpool, Ballack to Chelsea, great one, McManaman to Madrid, McAllister to Liverpool. Let's see what else. Bunker to Juve. So yeah, we've got quite a lot of ones. Lewandowski as well, which is a really good one. I think when he moved from Dortmund to Munich. So yeah, I agree with all of those. Sol Campbell was more or less one of the biggest early ones. It was pretty contentious as well because he moved from Spurs to Arsenal, and then obviously won a lot in all of those invincible season, and then obviously with the team as well during that Arsene Wenger era. So they were the three things, just to recap briefly, which is transfer fees and the difference between fixed and contingent and installments. The second is sell-on clauses and why they can be so useful. And third is the advent of Bosman and why that's been so significant for the industry, specifically for players' ability to be able to extol a lot more value because there is no transfer fee for the buying club to pay, and how that can actually work in their favor for when they're negotiating much stronger positions. So let's just have a quick look at then some of the questions that have come in. We've got one from Hilda, TPO being banned. Do you agree that economic rights of players should not be sold? So I'm going to hold fire on that one because we've got a whole session actually on third-party ownership, third-party investment in a couple of weeks. And so I want to hold fire on that. But needless to say, actually, there are some provisions that have come in by FIFA in the summer, which effectively allow a player to be able to re-own his or her economic rights. So there is the possibility under the FIFA regulations now, query whether that's the same as under the Premier League or FA or EFL, that players can actually own their economic rights and then can have a particular stake in a future transfer fee, and whether that's a possibility under the new regulations. So that's something to consider there. Please comment on why EU players agree to deals with a year left on their contract, carrying hefty transfer fee, whilst US players never do this. This is from Stephen Ross. I'm not actually sure the question there, why EU players agree to deals with 1 year left on contracts. I think the idea is, I think, Stephen, if I've got that right, it's that why would players who are out of contract in a year agree to new deals when they can effectively be on Bosman's in a year or so's time, and then be able to get potentially much more higher wages as a result of that. I guess it's just the negotiation and bargaining position at the time of the deal. It might well be that the player actually wants to stay at the club, wants to negotiate a much better deal. And as a player's contract winds down, even from 2 years to 18 months to 1 year, clubs are always getting more nervous, will always get more nervous simply because they won't be able to maximize a transfer fee or the transfer value of that player if the player wants to move. So a lot of the time, clubs will also be thinking, if a player has 2 years, 18 months, even 12 months left on the deal, which is obviously not great for the club, they'll have to be considering about whether they're going to sell them, whether they're going to offer them a more lucrative contract. And the agent's obviously in a strong position there for the elite players that have less amount of time left on their contract to be able to work out what the best position for the player might be. Obviously, the closer a player gets to winding down his contract, whether they then sign a pre-contract with 6 months to go with another club, which is permissible under the FIFA regulations, there can be risks. It might well be that a player doesn't go into form at the right time. It might be that he gets a long-term injury. There are other issues which might limit the attractiveness of that particular player, and that's always something that those players have got to bear in mind, and the agent's got to bear in mind too. Sinner, you've got a question on 18.4 of the FIFA regs. I'm going to hold back on that one because I need to have a look to see what 18.4 specifically says before I can comment in quite a lot of detail there. Mark O'Neill's made a question about explain more about the Webster decision, and have you seen some articles saying that Neymar could use this to move back to Barca? So the Webster decision is more or less a decision based on the FIFA regulations that relate to where players can more or less breach their contracts, leave their club and go to another club for a set amount of money. And the Webster case was an interesting one because the CAS effectively said that Webster could leave. I think it was Hearts, I think at the time. I think it was either going to Hearts. I have to remind myself in a second. But the idea effectively was that the only compensation that would be payable would effectively be the remaining amount of his wages. And that was the amount that would be payable by way of his ability then to breach his contract and move to a new club. Now, ultimately, what happened in subsequent cases, there were cases called Matusalem, De Sanctis, Diarra, and others. And a different line was taken effectively for breach of contract cases, whereby actually the unamortized transfer value of the actual player was taken into account, and that actually meant that players could be on the hook for several million, and in Matusalem's case, it was in the tens of millions of euros position. So the general perspective tends to be that players that want to effectively breach their contract to move to another club, and there is a mechanism to be able to do that, you'd have to be very careful about, simply because the amounts that clubs will pay for players are significant, and the player needs to be pretty well advised as to what the risks might be if he breaches that contract, and the value that then attaches to that contract by the arbitral body that then makes the decision. Another question by Hilda. Do you think that players should be able to be transferred outside of the transfer windows? Managers, for example, join teams on an interim basis to steady the ship until the end of the season. Well, there's definitely a question mark over the legality of the transfer window. Now, there've been a variety of cases, not necessarily in football, but there was a basketball case which related to, I think it was Latonen, which was to do with the transfer windows, basketball transfer windows. And the general approach being is there is a real argument as to integrity of competition, that if you don't have transfer windows, for example, then the richer clubs could buy players at particular times if other players are out of form, or effectively be able to buy players right up until the end of the season, as used to be the case, I think, when you could buy players up to March, particularly at certain times. But the integrity of competition argument is pretty strong, which is you go in with your squad, you can change your squad halfway through the season, potentially with the winter window, and then you've got to keep that squad intact. And just because, for example, some clubs might not be getting relegated, might not be going for promotion or winning the championship, maybe they might have an incentive to sell their best players at particular times. And that stability of season and that integrity of competition point is usually quite a strong one. So I think there's probably strong grounds for assessing why the restrictions as to the transfer windows are pretty, I guess, under EU competition law would be fair, proportionate, and non-discriminatory, don't go probably beyond what is necessary to achieve the aim, which is the aim of the competition, which I guess is to make sure that you have relative equality of position once the season started, bearing in mind obviously the January window. So that's that question. Seeing what others, got lots of other ones coming up. Question about would compensation be, this is from Barris, would a compensation paid to a club by a player as to a sell-on clause be counted as transfer income in terms of financial fair play? Really good question. So yeah, if there's a sell-on clause, that would be classed as revenue for FFP purposes. It would be classed as revenue under the regulations, and that would be a way to effectively be able to more likely comply with the regulations. So yeah, totally right there. Yeah, sell-on clauses would be classed as revenue, I believe, under the FFP regs. Vasilis, one question regarding taxation of transfer fees. Can contingent payments enjoy different tax status, and also are the transfer fees tax amortized by the club? I'm not a tax lawyer, so I'd have to probably defer on that point, only to say usually I believe, I could be wrong, is that the idea of contingent payments, there's a good question there as to at what point they are taxed. It's usually, I believe, at the point that the amounts crystallize, i.e. actually occur, but I don't probably know more than that, unfortunately. Got one from George Ryan. Does a player's brand or footballing ability hold more influence on the value of a transfer? Take Ibra, for example, huge social following potential, past it ability-wise, controversial there on Ibrahimovic. But yeah, it's an interesting one now, because obviously, you know, for the club, ultimately, the main value of a player is really going to be on their on-field performance. That being said, there's obviously a number of global superstars. There's obviously, you know, Kylian Mbappe, for example, now that is, you know, undoubtedly a World Cup winner, probably one of the best players in the world at the moment. If he were to transfer, for example, to a Nike club, he's already obviously a Nike club in PSG, that would hold significant commercial advantages for Nike as well, potentially for the commercial value of that. The club commercial value for that particular player association, etc. So there's tons of particular things from a commercial brand activation perspective, but on the whole, usually the club is more or less going for their on-pitch value. Now, what we'll talk about in a couple of days' time is to do with image rights, and the point generally being is obviously as players become more valuable off the field as on the field, what we actually are seeing is clubs paying a significant proportion of the player's total remuneration for particular off-field matters. If it's making appearances, if it's using their image, if it's exploiting their social voice and their social platform to be able to advertise particular club products or club partner products. So, you know, there's no doubt that players off-field image and value is becoming an important part of the overall commercial piece. But I haven't seen too many examples of when players will be bought for their commercial acumen or their commercial value rather than their on-pitch status. Question from Javier. From your experience in a transfer, what percentage of cases of agents, sorry, I'm not sure what other percent, sorry, I'm not quite sure I understand the question, Javier, sorry. Let's go and take one from Panagotis. So how do you see the supervening transfer window going to work? What will happen with players whose contracts expire at the end of June? So I'll take this probably as the last one, if that's all right. And then we'll go from there. So yeah, I've done a recent podcast actually on that with one of the guys in our team, Alex Harvey. from the Sheridan's team. So I really want to, if you can, check out that podcast. It's the latest one on what happens with an elongated season. I think the short answer is, for players that have their contracts expiring at the end of June, there might be the possibility to extend them with the agreement of both parties. But otherwise, I can't imagine they're going to be obliged to sign short-term deals. The issue more or less is that if the season extends into the summer period and then the transfer window extends into the period after, when the period where the season finishes, it might be some time before then a player whose contract expires at the 30th of June can actually then be registered to sign with a new club under his employment contract or her employment contract. So that's a bit of a tricky one at the moment. So we are at 30 minutes. I don't want to keep everyone for too much longer. Thank you so much for all the questions. I'm sorry I haven't been able to get through all of them. As usual, what I want to try and just do for 1 or 2 minutes, if that's all right, is make a couple of recommendations as always. First thing I'd say is, obviously yesterday I recommended a football agent book. I'm going to recommend a slightly different book tonight, which is called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And it's one of my favorite books. You can see from it being a bit worn that I constantly have read it over the years. It's by a guy called Dale Carnegie, and it was actually written quite a long time ago, but it has some fascinating insights generally on, I mean, I'm not a massive fan of the title, to be fair, but it has some great insights on how to interact with people, how to work best with people, how to get the best out of your relationships. And there's a brilliant chapter on listening better. And it really changed my perspective and view on how best to conduct meetings, how to actually really listen to people, and how to understand what people want rather than what you want to be able to tell people. So How to Win Friends and Influence People, really recommend it, comes highly recommended. It's my Bible on so many things of building relationships, etc. So feel free to have a read of that if you can, when you've got a bit of downtime over this period now as well. Obviously, you can follow me on all my social channels. Hopefully you guys know it would be on Twitter, Football Law, on Instagram, Football Law, on LinkedIn. I've got a TikTok account now. You'd be glad to know I'm not dancing on it or doing too much music, but just clipping some of my particular talks that I've given on loads of different topics. And again, if it's all right, I'd just like to give a quick shout out to the same charity, which I'll be trying to do over the course of the next few weeks. Charity again is Noah's Ark Hospice. It's a hospice in northwest London that serves terminally ill and really sick young kids. They've got a massive shortfall in terms of funding at the moment because of Corona and everything that's going on at the moment. If you've got the chance to spread the word, tell people about the charity generally, amplify the message as it goes. I'll tweet a link to it for anyone to be able to use, which would be fantastic. And thank you as always for joining me. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow, where I'll be talking on player contracts. Thanks again, guys. Bye.